Okay, you see the headlines every single day about the Russo-Ukrainian war. But how do you get past the noise to the real story? Well, today, we're going to dig into a book by a historian who had no choice but to write it all down as it was happening. It's Serhii Plokhy's The Russo-Ukrainian War. And let me tell you, this isn't just a history lesson, it's like an urgent message from a conflict that is shaping our world right now. So, let's dive in.
For the author, Serhii Plokhy, the war didn't start with some breaking news alert. Nope. It started with 2 words in an email. My goodness. Just try to imagine that. You're a historian, you're in Vienna, you're buried in archives, studying one historic disaster, Chernobyl, and then you find out a brand new one is unfolding back home. That feeling, that personal gut punch, is really the engine that drives this entire book.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down for you. First, we'll get into the very personal why behind this book. Then, we'll look at the historical map he lays out. After that, we're going to dig into the 3 main roots of the conflict he identifies. Then, we'll talk about the book's biggest strengths, and finally, we'll look at its place as a first draft of history.
So let's start right there. Because to really get this book, you have to get the author. I mean, what makes a historian, someone who studies the past, suddenly start writing about the present as it's exploding? We have to understand the why. The irony here is just incredible. 1 minute, Plokhy is a Harvard scholar, looking at history from a safe distance. The next, he's on the phone with his sister in Zaporizhia, listening to explosions in the background. In that moment, history wasn't something in a book anymore. It was happening to him. And he had to write, not just as a historian, but as a Ukrainian. So this brings up a huge question, one that kind of hangs over this whole project. Historians, they usually like distance, right? They want to wait for the dust to settle, for the archives to open. So why would a scholar like Plokhy jump in and start writing a history while the bombs are literally still falling? What's the deal with that? And the answer really is pure emotion. He's very clear about it. This book wasn't some calculated academic project, it was a gut reaction. It came from shock, from pain, from anger. For him, writing was a way to make sense of the chaos, to fight back. It was a way to channel all that emotion into something clear, and he did it, as he says, in record time because the situation demanded it. Okay, so we've got the personal why, that intense emotional urgency. But how does he turn that into a book that makes sense? How does he build a logical argument? Let's take a look at the actual framework he uses to explain how we got to 2022. The biggest idea in the whole book is that 2022 didn't just come out of nowhere. It was a boiling point. And to get it, Plokhy says you have to go all the way back to 1991. He shows how all these tensions from the Soviet collapse were just left simmering for decades, pushing Russia and Ukraine down 2 completely different paths that were bound to crash. And he organizes this whole 30-year story with a super clear 4-part structure. He starts with the messy, unfinished collapse of the Soviet Empire. Then he traces how Russia and Ukraine went in opposite directions politically. Next, he zooms in on all the flashpoints that led up to 2014. And finally, he analyzes the full-scale war. This step-by-step logic is really the backbone of his whole argument. All right, we've covered the author's motivation, we've covered the book's structure. Now, let's get to the real heart of it all. What are the 3 most important arguments he makes? If you remember nothing else, these are the key takeaways about where this war really came from. Okay, so the first big idea is what he calls a deceiving peace. When other big empires ended, the French, the Portuguese, it was brutal, long, bloody wars. But the Soviet Union, it just kind of dissolved. It seemed peaceful, but Plokhy says that was a total illusion. The big questions about borders and power were never really answered. The violence wasn't avoided, it was just put on pause, waiting to explode later. So the second key point is about what happened after that so-called peace. It's like Russia and Ukraine came to a fork in the road and went in totally opposite directions. In Russia, you see this steady march toward a super strong presidency and autocracy. Meanwhile, Ukraine develops this messy, loud, but real democracy where people could actually vote their leaders out. And this growing difference became a huge source of tension, because Russia started to see Ukraine's democracy as a direct threat to its own system. The third root of the conflict isn't about politics or borders. It's a battle over history itself. And honestly, this quote from Putin right before the invasion says it all. He's basically trying to erase Ukraine from the map. Not with tanks, but with words. He's claiming it's not a real country. And Plokhy argues this isn't just political rhetoric. This is the core justification for the whole war, the belief that Ukraine simply doesn't have the right to exist on its own terms. Okay, so we've walked through the book's main arguments. But now let's switch gears a little bit. Beyond what he's saying, let's talk about how he says it. What makes this book so effective and powerful? Let's dig into its major strengths.
The first and most obvious strength is just the incredible historical depth. I mean, this is where Plokhy really shines as a world-class historian. He doesn't just start the story in 1991. He goes back centuries, explaining things like Kiev and Rus, the origins of New Russia, and even how old Cossack fighting styles connect to Ukraine's strategy today. He gives you this rich, layered context that you just can't get from reading the news.
The book's second great strength is its humanity. This is not some dry geopolitical chess game. Plokhy is a master at weaving in the voices of people actually living through it. I mean, just read this quote from a defender in the Azovstal steel plant. "The place of my death and my life." It's just haunting. These personal stories give the whole thing a powerful human heartbeat.
And he doesn't just focus on soldiers. He balances it with a civilian experience. He includes accounts from people like Diana, a student just trying to survive in a bomb shelter. When you read that, you feel the cold, you feel the fear. Putting these voices next to the high-level political analysis makes sure you never forget the real human cost of all this. And all of that leads to its third and maybe most unique strength, its sheer urgency. Because he wrote it so fast, right in the middle of the crisis, the book just pulses with the raw shock of the moment. It feels less like a history book written years later and more like a live dispatch from inside an earthquake. And that gives it this visceral, emotional punch that's really hard to capture otherwise.
But you know, that very same strength, its immediacy, is also tied to its limitations. Every book has them. And to really appreciate this one, we need to be clear about what it is and what it isn't. It helps to think of it as what historians call a first draft of history. So yeah, the main limitation is right there in the name. It's a first draft. Plokhy himself is very upfront about writing it incredibly quickly. It is an absolutely invaluable guide to what's happening right now, but it can't have the final word. I mean, how could it? Future historians will have access to archives that are locked right now, and they'll know how this all ends. They're going to write different books.
The second limitation comes down to sources, which is just a reality of writing during a war. You can only use the information that's available. So naturally, the book relies heavily on things like Western intelligence, media reports, and Ukrainian accounts. Getting information from inside Russia is obviously extremely difficult. Now, that doesn't mean the book is wrong. It just means the perspective is shaped by what was knowable at the time.
And finally, there's the question of focus. This book is a masterclass in political and military history. It's fantastic at explaining the decisions of presidents and generals, but because it has that top-down view, there's less space for the bottom-up story. You know, how regular people's lives and cultures were changing over time. It's a powerful way to tell the story, but it's not the only way.
So, what's the bottom line here? Look, despite the limitations that come with writing in the heat of the moment, Plokhy's book is absolutely essential. It gives you the deep historical why that is so often missing from the day-to-day news coverage. If you really want to get beyond the headlines and understand the roots of this conflict, this is the place to start. It's a foundational text.
And that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. This whole book is built on the idea that you can't understand the present without understanding the past. So the question for all of us is this. In our world of instant information and 24/7 news cycles, how much does that deep history really matter when we have to make urgent decisions about a crisis that's happening right now?